Uh, Good morning, everyone. Welcome to ODI on a Monday morning. Eid Mubarak. Welcome to the meeting on African industrialization and entrepreneurship. That's jointly hosted by the OECD Development Center and the Tony Blair Institute for Global Change and the Overseas Development Institute, and in particular the Supporting Economic Transformation Program at the ODI, which I'm directing here at ODI, and that's funded by the Department for International Development. Industrialization is a very interesting topic for us. We work a lot on this issue. We think it's really important in transforming African economies and in creating jobs. And we do a range of work. We were 2 weeks ago in Addis Ababa. We had a sort of a Pan-African meeting on industrialization, and we were hearing how Ethiopia is doing extremely well, where industrialization is growing at a fast pace. It's growing 25% a year, the manufacturing sector. We're very pleased that the ambassador from Ethiopia is here as well. And we do a range of other work. Just a week ago, we were launching a booklet on 10 policy priorities to transform industry and create jobs in Kenya, which with the Kenyan Association of Manufacturers, which they are using at the moment in the debates leading up to the presidential elections. And we do some other work as well. But here today we are looking at a range of other work that has been done. And we're very pleased that we are hosting the UK launch of the African Economic Outlook, which is this book, and I'm sure you can pick up a copy either outside or later on your chair. It's a UNDP, OECD, and African Development Bank publication. I'm sure Federico will discuss that in a minute. There will also be a discussion on a range of other work. But let me first sort of introduce the stellar panel that we've got here today. So on my right, we've got Federico Bonaglia. He is the Deputy Director at the OECD Development Center. Welcome. And he'll be presenting on the report. We'll then hear from Jonathan Said, who's there on the left. He heads up the private sector development work at the Tony Blair Institute for Global Change, and we'll also discuss a paper that he's been working on, discussing about the how-to of industrialization. And then we've got some very interesting discussants, one from the public sector from a donor. So we've got on my left here Rachel Turner, who is the Director General for Economic Development at the Department for International Development. And I must say that all the interesting and important work at DFID sits within Rachel's team, whether it is about the CDC recapitalization and strategy, whether it is about training relationships, and you might say a bit more on the announcement that has been made yesterday, but also some very exciting work around attracting investment in African countries, including in the manufacturing sector. And then we will hear from Desde Mazi, who is at WITS, but also at the Investec Institute. And I think you've just come in from Basel talking to the African governors about automation and industrialization, so we'd like to hear from you as well. This meeting is online, it's streamed online, so if there are questions, you can send them through the iPad and I will refer them to the panel. The meeting is recorded, so in 24 hours or so there will be a recording online, and you can then look at it again. So with that introduction, I'd like to go first to Federico for your introductory presentation. I'll invite them to talk about 10 minutes each, and then discuss for about 5 to 10 minutes. So we have about 40 minutes, and then around 45 minutes for questions and answer with the audience.
Thank you. Thank you, Dirk. Good morning, everybody. It's a great honor to be here again, and I would like to thank ODI for the kind hospitality. And it's really an honor and a pleasure to be with such good panel members with us today. I will walk you through the latest African economic outlook, and I plan to do it in two moments. I will first give you very quickly a kind of general overview of how we see African growth prospects over the next couple of years, and put them in a bit longer term perspective as a kind of appetizer. And then I will go more in depth around the theme of industrialization and entrepreneurship. But before I start, let me say just a few words of where we come from and why this report. As Dirk said, I'm the Deputy Director of the OECD Development Center. There is a special organization within the OECD that you may be familiar with, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. We're based in Paris. The OECD brings together 35, let's say, economically advanced democracies. The Development Center has a slightly different membership because we are open to non-OECD member countries. And so today we have 25 countries that are from outside the OECD, of which 9 are located in Africa. And then we have 11 in Latin America and the rest in Asia. We have big countries with us. We have South Africa, we have China, we have India, we have Brazil, but we also have smaller countries. We have Cape Verde, we have Mauritius, we have Vietnam, Thailand, Costa Rica, Dominican Republic. So quite a diverse set of countries. Every year we produce jointly with the African Development Bank and UNDP the African Economic Outlook. And this is, I think, the 16th edition of the report. Is a unique report that covers the entirety of the continent. So we have 54 in-depth country notes that are available online for free download. We have a chapter that monitors the macroeconomic developments of the continent every year, and then every year we choose a specific theme. And the theme is chosen so as to be useful for the discussion that is taking place among African policymakers, but also between African policymakers and their partners, including donor agencies, financial institutions, etc., etc. So we support in particular the priorities of the African Union 2063 agenda, that is an agenda for transformation of Africa. And I like very much the supporting economic transformation approach, because I think this is the key. And you will see in our presentation why transformation remains a major challenge for Africa. So let me go now straight into my presentation. I don't know whether it can be shown on the slide. Here it is. So I will, as I said, go through two moments in the presentation. First one, the macroeconomic outlook, and then industrialization and entrepreneurship. What is the storyline here? What are the key messages? Well, the first headline is that we see Africa growing again. The situation now is better than last year. We project to have growth at around 3.4% in 2017 and 4.3% in 2018. This is better than the 2% that we had in 2016, but still below what we used to observe in the early parts of the 2000s. So, situation improving, but not as good as before. What is interesting is that if you look at the regional distribution, East Africa is clearly leading the charge. We have growth that is around 6% for the region, while Southern Africa is unfortunately lagging behind. We are below 2%. West Africa used to be a good performer. Unfortunately, Nigeria has been going through quite a difficult time. They were in recession, and because of the size of the economy, this has driven down the performance of the region. What is interesting to see is that the situation is changing in Africa. We have often seen African performance driven by what's happening outside of Africa, namely commodity prices. They still play a very important role, but the situation is changing because we see domestic drivers of growth that are emerging. And in fact, this year, 60% of growth is driven by domestic factors, household consumption and government investment. Still, the external condition matters, and our forecast of next year reaching 4.3% hinges upon oil prices regaining a bit of ground, and the latest figures are not so optimistic, but let's hope. What remains as a major challenge for African development is that growth has not been able to generate enough jobs. We know that every year there are 29 million young people that enter the labor market, so jobs need to be created for these 29 million people. And despite growth rates averaging more than 5% for over 10 years, job creation has been not satisfactory. There is clearly a demand for more public policies that can help supporting enterprise creation, employment creation. But for this to happen, there is a major financing challenge. And African financing remains stable. So if you look at the external sources of financing, we see that aid is more or less stable, slightly declining, but still remaining there. Remittances are on the increase. They are the single most important source of external financing. FDI are recovering. Portfolio flows are going down. On the domestic side, which is the most important part, because no government can develop within domestic resources without taxes, basically. On average, African tax to GDP ratio is about 16%. This is half what we observe in the OECD countries, while in Latin America we are around 23. The OECD is 33, 34, Africa 16. There is a huge variation across countries, of course, and you have countries that have made big progress. What is interesting is that these revenues have been decreasing slightly over the last 2 years because of the impact of lower commodity prices and so royalties, lower royalties, but the non-extractive part of these tax revenues has remained stable, which shows some resilience. So this is the first part of my presentation. I will go very quickly through the slides because I want to focus on the second part, which is industrialization and entrepreneurship. This is a major question for addressing the job creation problem of Africa. Private sector development, enterprise development is the priority, and we will go through the different parts in a second. So I show you the economic performance. We are getting a bit out of the woods, but still not as good as before. Regionally, East Africa is doing better than the rest. Southern Africa is lagging behind. 60% of growth driven by domestic sources, which is good news. External sources of financing, you see the orange part is the aid part. So you see that there's been a slight decline over the last few years, but we are still around the $50 billion per year. FDI, which is the red part, is on the increase. And what is interesting is that more than 40% of FDI projects, of new FDI projects, are going to sectors that are non-extractives. So outside of oil, gas, and mining, which testimony a bit of diversification taking place in African economies. And as I said, remittances remain the single largest source of external financing. If we look at portfolio flows, that is the green part, this has been dramatically declining, although they remain relatively small in absolute terms. I also talked to you about domestic revenues, and you see that tax to GDP, tax collection in Africa has been a bit on the decline, but this has mostly been due to declining royalties because of the lower commodity prices. So let's go now to the second part of my presentation, industrialization and entrepreneurship. I have four major messages to share with you here. The first one is that structural transformation remains a major challenge for Africa. What is structural transformation? Very simple. Moving people and resources from low productivity sectors to higher productivity sectors and increasing the productivity within this sector. Now, if you look at this chart, it depicts to you on the horizontal axis the share of employment in the economy. So the green is agriculture, and the bottom right, my bottom right, is mining. And on the vertical axis, you have the productivity of the sector as a share of the average productivity, labor productivity. We're not talking about total factor productivity, but the situation, I suppose, is not very different. So what you see here is that there are huge variation in levels of productivity across sectors. So mining is, or utilities are 10, 30, 20 times more productive than the average. Problem, they employ very small part of the population. If you look at where most of the population is employed, 60% is agriculture. And what the bad news about agriculture? Productivity is very low. So despite huge improvements over the last 10 years, this is the major challenge that Africa is facing. How to move resources from low productivity sectors to higher productivity sectors, and how to increase productivity within sectors, notably in agriculture. What is my second message? My second message is that we need to rethink industrialization strategies. If you look at the share of manufacturing in African GDP, today we are below what it used to be in the 70s. So today manufacturing in GDP is around 11%. In the early 70s it was around 17%. In Asia it has been the reverse. So manufacturing strategies of the past have not really worked very well, and we will probably discuss why in a second. But if we want today to focus on new strategies for industrialization manufacturing, we need to take into account that the situation has changed. And so you have an external context that is very different. We're talking about Industry 4.0, we're talking about automation, digitalization, and we are also talking about a global environment that in terms of trade and investment policies may be changing. So industrialization strategies in Africa need to take into account both this technological change, so what will be the impact of automation and technology, and the policy change. What is going to change in terms of regional integration, trade liberalization, investment liberalization. Third message is that the African strategies need to put a greater emphasis on entrepreneurs than what they've done in the past. Industrialization strategies in the past have largely focused on big, capital-intensive state-owned enterprises that have delivered little. You've seen the manufacturing share of value added that has not substantially increased. Very little attention has been paid to the role of micro, small, and medium enterprises. And if you look at some of the data, you realize that these enterprises have a very significant potential for job creation. This is an example. On the horizontal axis, we have the age of the firms, 5 years or younger. And if you look at the number of employees, this is the different colors. So the small firms, the ones that are young and small, less than 20 employees and very young, they account for the largest share of employment generation. So if employment is the priority, you cannot ignore what is going on with the small and medium enterprises. What is the problem with the entrepreneurship in Africa? Is that, unfortunately, most of the entrepreneurs, I'm almost run out of my time, sorry. Most of the entrepreneurs are actually in low productivity sectors, in sectors where there are very little barrier to entry, like retail, trade, hotels and restaurants, but they also have very little potential for productivity growth, so very little potential for contributing to the structural transformation that was mentioned before. While there are other sectors, including in the services sector, including agriculture, that may have a huge potential for transformation. So public policies that are supporting entrepreneurs need to take into account this need of facilitating a move towards other sectors. What is then the final message that I have with you? Is that for you? So far, policies to support entrepreneurs have been blind to the type of entrepreneurs that they were supporting. And if you look at the characterization of entrepreneurs in Africa, you can distinguish between two broad groups. What we call necessity-driven entrepreneurs, basically people that declare themselves to be entrepreneurs because they didn't find a wage employment. So they try to become entrepreneurs because they didn't have any other opportunity. On the other hand, you have opportunity-driven entrepreneurs, people that have an idea, that have capacity, that have a drive, motivation, they want to be entrepreneurs. Now, most of policies and most of support programs from development partners have been blind to this reality, and they've focused on supporting whatever type of entrepreneur, also for poverty alleviation reasons, which are very important, and we should not deny them. But clearly, as Tim Bergen used to say, you need the appropriate number of instruments for the goals that you have, and you need to have the right instruments. So if you want to undertake poverty alleviation, there are other instruments. If you want to support enterprise creation, you probably need to use different type of instruments. And here, and it's going to be my last message, is that if you need to decide where you want to put your euro, your pound, your dollar, your extra dollar, or your yen, or even better, your yuan, skills and infrastructures are the two areas where more needs to be done. And we know a lot about infrastructure, and I suppose that my colleagues here in the panel will probably say something about that. So let me focus on skills. Unfortunately, managerial skills are a problem in Africa, not only in Africa, but in many countries. So managers of enterprises do not have the right type of skills to conduct their business. So very often they remain in the informal economy, and they have very low rate of productivity. And the system for producing skills is also not working well enough. So this chart tells us an interesting story, that if you look at the share of students that are currently enrolled in technical education and vocational education and training, African countries overall, they don't look that bad. There is about 11%, 10.5% of students that are enrolled in this type of education, more than Latin America, more than South Asia. There is, of course, a huge variation across countries. So Egypt is more than 20%, Ghana is less than 2%. But when you dig a bit deeper and you try to look at the type of skills that are acquired, they're not the ones that entrepreneurs are looking for. And second, when you look at the resources that government put into this sector, they're very small. If you look at the overall budget for the educational system, in Africa, the resources that are placed for the technical education are between 2% and 6% of educational budgets, that by themselves are really quite small. So there is clear a huge reform agenda that together with, and maybe we can discuss this in the question and answer because I ran out of my time, but together with more consolidated business development services and cluster can help African governments to address the entrepreneurship and job creation challenge.
Federico, thank you very much. Really good. Just one question. So you mentioned about targeting opportunity-driven entrepreneurs. I mean, first of all, I think this is something that is sort of remarkable coming from an OECD, which tends to be focused on investment frameworks, investment codes, multinational codes, and the like. So you're thinking about targeting particular entrepreneurs. But how do we know whether an entrepreneur is opportunity-driven? How can a donor or a public policymaker know that this is a particular opportunity-driven entrepreneur?
Well, the data that we show, entrepreneurs self-declare themselves. Mm-hmm. So this is data that comes from the global entrepreneurship monitoring exercise. And so they ask the question of, how would you define, say, why did you choose to be an entrepreneur, kind of thing. So there is information that you can use. But what we are suggesting here is not to target individual entrepreneurs, but to create conditions that can support those entrepreneurs that are motivated and have the capacity to be entrepreneurs to kind of fulfill their dream or realize their potential. So this has to do with the type of services and the type of programs that you put in place. And I think that the clustering approach and the provision of business development services through incubators is a very interesting avenue to go. So today, entrepreneurs are maybe given some kind of subsidies or access to facilitated loans, but they don't get access to the type of information, the type of services, the facilities that they need to build and develop their business. So we have experiences in OECD country. I'm Italian, as my accent shows. In Italy, we created, institutions, both public and private, establish large institutions, sometimes with 100 people working there, that are totally dedicated to provide services, business development services to enterprises. Mm-hmm. And these are run, funded, and managed by the private sector very often, or by public-private partnership. So this is where I say, bring the entrepreneurs on board, listen to what they need, and give them the services that they need, rather than
Yeah, okay, good.
What I mean.
So a lot of discussion about what needs to be done. Yeah. Let's focus on the how-to. So Jonathan's site is part of the Tony Blair Institute that have had a range of advisors embedded in African governments to think very much about the how-to of private sector development, inclusive growth. And you've just written a paper sort of aggregating the information, what you've learned. So we'd really like to hear from you. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Dirk, and again also from our organization, thank you very much for this opportunity as well to present our paper today, which we are launching just this morning, and the paper is available on our website at the moment. The paper is based on our own experiences working in, work in a number of countries particularly in Africa. But we work particularly with, as embedded advisors on private sector development, specifically in 4 countries: Liberia, Sierra Leone on the west coast, in West Africa, and Rwanda and Ethiopia in East Africa. Just want to check if the PowerPoint can come up. Just so that, yeah, there you go. That's it. Thank you. So the paper, just going back, the paper is called The Jobs Gap, and it's about how to make inclusive growth work in Africa, just bringing forward our experiences and our own learning. And so what I want to do today is focus on 3 things. The first is to make a case why the current common approach to economic development in Africa is not delivering the structural transformation that Federico talked about. argue why modern industrial policy is important, and we call this market-based sector development, and we explain what this is. And then the key part is suggest, okay, how can we actually go about it, as Dirk mentioned. So, of course, the current enabling environment approach is full of a lot of reasonable things, right? Promoting openness to trade, leveling the playing field for all businesses, generic investments in the infrastructure, the doing business reforms, etc. But I won't dwell on this slide. As was mentioned, the structural change that we need for inclusive growth purposes in Africa hasn't been happening. And this has serious implications, particularly on what we call the jobs gap, basically the difference between the number of people coming onto the market looking for economic opportunities and then what the economic opportunities that the economy itself is able to provide. And so we look at this metric here, which is just the difference between the labor force and total employment opportunities, and this is increasing. And on current trends, unless we're able to buck this trend, we'll hit around 50 million. And this has serious implications for education, for healthcare, for food security, for migration, and so it is also for widening of the tax base as well. And so this stuff matters and is important. So let's take a step back first and look at the problems with the enabling environment approach to economic development in Africa. So the first thing is it does tend to assume implicitly in practice that all firms tend to face the same constraints. And so you tend to have policies that are standardized and that, but in of themselves obviously end up having different implications on different businesses. It also tends to assume that institutions themselves have the capacity to deliver those wide range of reforms we mentioned before, but in low capacity government, which is typically the case in many countries where we work, then this is not possible. And actually, more importantly, it makes another more subtle implicit implication, which is that you kind of first build government capacity, and then that gives you, and then you have the institutions to then deliver the enabling environment for businesses, and then businesses can come and create jobs. But it doesn't quite work like that. What you have to look at the things that are actually going to give the political incentives in particular to the government to actually want to invest in the capacity that is necessary. And so once you go a step back, you've got the political economy, and then you have the underlying economic structure. And the problem that we tend to see in many countries is that the current economic structure leads to cases where the businesses that have political capital that can then provide political capital to ministers, for example, tend to come from sectors like mining or logging, or typically the importation of various goods and services. And the things that they ask for in return for that political support are things which are not necessarily the things that we need for inclusive growth. Typically might be preferential licenses or tax rebates, for example. And then the next big problem is that governments are doomed to choose anyway, right? You have a Ministry of Agriculture, you have a Ministry of Public Works, you have a Ministry of Youth and Sport, for example, of TVET, but how do you actually allocate resources limited resources, and in some countries, sometimes almost non-existent discretionary spend, to those limited ministries? And those are going to have differential impacts on your businesses. But the most important thing is it doesn't provide any real basis for coordination and policy coherence for many governments in Africa. And this is from the private sector, from the entrepreneurs we're trying to support, probably the worst thing, because you need to know what the direction of travel is. You need to know where you're going to get your inputs, where you're going to be able to produce, what regulatory framework you have to be able to respect, where your markets are going to be for you to want to invest. And so the basis for coordination of disparate ministries and agencies across, which typically can be up to 15 or 20 that shape the enabling environment for a particular sector, is typically missing. So how do we get economic transformation? What we need is politically smart, market-based sector development. The US, as Federico was saying, focusing on specific sectors and identify sectors that can create jobs. Not just that can create jobs, but actually put you on a path to downstream value addition, considering the product space, for example. And then focusing on fixing the binding constraints in those specific sectors. And accounting for the political economy realities that shape the decision makers, that affect decision makers that need to put their career at stake to make those changes. So the problem is this hasn't really been applied well in Africa. It is difficult. It's very difficult to do, and that's important for us to recognize that. But there are some things that we can do to make our life easier. First of all, a failure to account for counter incentives. So an experience from Liberia where I've been working is an M4P project, a project to make markets work for the poor, which is trying to support the cocoa sector. Then it's identified the regulatory framework as a barrier. But the focal person working in the Ministry of Agriculture didn't quite have an incentive to put a regulatory framework in place because he was connected to the traders that stood to lose from that regulatory framework. And so that binding constraint went unaddressed. Similarly, the key point is that many efforts to develop sectors in many countries are not championed typically by centers of government. I think Ethiopia is one of the few handful of exceptions there. There's a few others, Mauritius, Morocco, that are others. But the majority of countries, easily 40-odd countries in Africa, it's not championed by the centers of government. And so that means also that you have the right type, the support that's necessary for the center of government to take ownership is missing. And that tends to lead to many disparate ministries and agencies, each setting their own policies on their own metrics without that communication between them. And sometimes inadvertently, some development partner projects do inadvertently tend to lead to pull governments in different directions, which makes it more difficult for them actually, given the limited capacity, to set that enabling environment for those specific sectors that can create jobs. So we end up with a situation like this, for example, which is quite common from our own experience, and we've seen this from working on the ground, is that you might have your main in-country donors promoting, generic things, open trade, revenue mobilization, transparency, etc. Then you've got your biggest in-country lobbies who might be, pushing for your mining preferential deals and your, preferential and also tax rebates for your importers, where a lot of money is made by businesses on the ground. But then you still have, for example, your Rome-based agencies focused on food security. So they're making a case to the Ministry of Agriculture to focus on maize and rice, typically. Ministry of Trade might be working with the Geneva-based organizations, and they might have done a national export strategy, and they're focusing on textile, sugar, and tourism as an example. And then IFC might have done its own analysis with the investment agency, and they're focused on other value chains. And then, of course, the Ministry of Finance, whose main constituent is IMF typically, and they're focused on the traditional sector where the short-term revenues come from. This doesn't work in a low capacity environment, and it doesn't work for private investment. So from our perspective, we've identified 4 key elements to get right. The politics and the economics simultaneously. So we need to understand the political dynamics both in the short term and the long term. And economically, what's going to have the business case, what's going to get the return in the short term, but also what are the sectors that are going to shift that political economy to one that's aligned to the structural transformation that's needed. Diagnosis and strategic approach is crucial. So it's not just about doing a growth diagnostic for the whole country and then saying, the binding constraint is energy, and therefore until we fix energy, not much can happen. We need to also understand, do diagnosis at the sector level as well, and identify the strategy and tactics that can work for the political realities of the decision makers in those specific sectors. And then, as referred to in the African Economic Outlook, the coordination mechanism and the enabling and the embedded delivery team are critical. You need a coordination mechanism, first of all, for government, because it's governments that have to lead the way. It's their own country, it's their own vision. And that's what's really essential, is to help government come together and steer the ship in one direction. So you don't have situations where, for example, the Ministry of Trade is trying to promote small businesses in oil palm, for example, value addition. But the Revenue Authority then has no real clue about that because they're focused on short-term revenues. And so they're trying to tax as much as they can out of things like plastic importation, which is key for SMEs in that sector. And we've seen many examples from our experience of cases where these things have worked well. So there are many positives out there for us to build on. In Rwanda, the strategic investment of CNH governments met both short-term needs. It gained political traction, so it helped the government gain strengthen politically. But also it was strategically important to help the country diversify away from its traditional sectors. Similarly, in Ethiopia, even if when we're doing analysis, we've seen a case where it's not just about coming up with a list of 100 actions that are everything that's necessary to transform that sector. but how do you translate that into something the politicians can actually run with? And there are a number of other examples talked about in the report. And this is my last slide. So if we speak specifically about what can development partners do to help, we would say, like, help government, first of all, play its role in developing market systems. How do we do this? It's ultimately the government's own vision for how, not just the government, the political elite at large, we would say, what is the underlying vision that governments have to transform their own country? And let's help them, let's support them to translate that into practice. Let's enhance it. Let's challenge, say, where the weaknesses are. And this sector might not actually lead to downstream value addition. These other sectors might. And let's invest in the right capacity, particularly, as mentioned in the AEO as well, is focus on the right strategic capacity. And implementation capacity. How do you actually translate a vision and start to get real traction on the ground with the people on the ground? And help local reformers to navigate politics. There are many, many local reformers in government, in the private sector that really want to see, they're passionate about their country and really want to see tangible change. Let's help them, give them the tools necessary for them to succeed. And the final point is, let's help governments themselves coordinate, take a strong lead, and around which different ministries can coalesce, like we've seen in Ethiopia. It took many years, to get there, and around which development partners can then program, as well as the private sector itself.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jonathan. That's been very good. My former boss used to comment during these type of meetings, and he would say, "What do you want to do on Monday morning? What are you going to do about this on Monday morning?" Well, it's Monday morning, and we have the what, and we have got the how to do it as well. So we've got the whole list, a specific list of things that need to be done. So we're really spoiled. Rachel, what do you do on a Monday morning? And are you convinced by the list? What can you let us know how you look at sort of the manufacturing sector, entrepreneurship from the Department for International Development's perspective?
Sure, but let me start by saying it's a great report. I mean, I really think it is a very rich report. It's very mineable, and I think there's a lot of the what, but also a lot of the how, and I look forward to really getting into the how as well through the report that you've launched today. I was thinking as you spoke whether what I'm going to say now would pass your test, so do hold me to account for that. I mean, I think a couple of things from the DFID point of view. I mean, we launched a new economic development strategy earlier in the year, and we did include in that, kind of right at the heart of that, we hope came through this very strong focus on supporting African governments in their path to structural transformation and industrialisation. I mean, we did also really try to get in there a sense of urgency, and I think it would be very useful to hear a bit more from others from the OECD, whether this sense of there being a kind of quite an opportunity right now, particularly for sub-Saharan Africa, to attract investment, and particularly this issue that we focused on, this sense that there's an opportunity now with Chinese investment in search of lower cost locations, whether this focus on sub-Saharan Africa doing something right now to attract that investment, and a sense of a lost opportunity if sub-Saharan Africa doesn't get that right. It would be useful to know if you feel that's right, or if I wonder if that's a little bit too panicky. So it would be useful to hear your response on that. But nevertheless, we have tried to focus very hard, particularly on the manufacturing piece, for various reasons. I mean, yes, the job reason, but also because we do feel that sectors that are firmly plugged into the wider global economy are the right sectors to be focusing on as we go forward. And I think the key phrase in the report, that more diversified economies perform significantly better than less diversified. I mean, it sounds facile, but I think it's really important that you've got that right up there. And I think focusing on the export-focused sectors in order to really try and bind sub-Saharan Africa particularly into global growth paths is very much at the heart of what we're doing. And again, it would be useful to see if you think that's right or if you want to challenge that. I mean, I was just going to say a couple of things about the what more specifically. We did last year launch a new program. We call it a flagship program called Invest Africa, which is specifically, we hope, trying to behave very much in the way you've said, with several elements to it. And I was just going to run through that because I think it is interesting vis-a-vis your list. I mean, what we're trying to do with that Invest Africa program, and we've given ourselves targets to reach in terms of mobilizing investment, we're trying to have at the heart of that quite an explicit link between investors, buyers, and the African government. So we've tried specifically to take one step back and not do the generic business environment work, but actually to try and pick up the specific regulatory and policy challenges that are raised by investors and begin to work with African governments to address those. And I mean, we absolutely think that the challenge to move away from the generic business environment work to the targeted work that's well taken, and we are trying to do that. It's not necessarily straightforward. I think one of the things that we're thinking about doing, and again, it would be useful to see if other people agree this is the right thing to be doing, is to really put more effort into the buying piece. We've tried in Ethiopia, and the ambassador from Ethiopia is here. We very much tried to play a brokering role to bring buyers and investors together in Ethiopia, and we think that's worked well. How much more should we be doing in that buying and purchasing space, that end of the trade route? It would be interesting to get advice from others here. We do think that there's a useful role and a possibility of creating some kind of buying platform, either here in the UK or more broadly. And I know the Dutch have gone some way down creating a platform, a facility to promote companies that are selling into the Netherlands, and I think that's an interesting thing to talk about. Is there a market failure there? Is that something we should be investing in? I mean, the other thing that's come over quite strongly when we talk to governments about how they would most like to see us working is very much in the training space, but absolutely responding to the specific training needs that the manufacturing firms identify. And again, one thing we're doing in Ethiopia is to support what we call the onboarding of 60,000 workers into the industrial parks, particularly the textile factories, working not just on the hard skills, but also the softer skills. So the skills about the commitment to work, managing absenteeism. And that's a message that's come over very strongly through the partnership conversations with the investors. The other piece that's come over strongly as a request to us has been to work on the kind of transparency and the stability around the actual labour market regulatory approaches. We had a big investment event earlier in the year with our Secretary of State and with Jim Kim, the President of the World Bank, with a lot of investors in the room. And something that they asked repeatedly for was clarity about how wages are set. So it isn't necessarily they need to know that wages will stay low, but they do need to understand what the public sector approach to wage setting is, and need to understand that there's a transparent and kind of known process with a known cycle for taking decisions. So we've also been working with the ILO. The ILO have a series of programs in South Asia, and we're working with the ILO to move some of those programs into Africa, and that's a very interesting piece of work to follow, I think, as well. So I think just two final points from me on I guess, are they how or are they what? I think they're how. I mean, something that we're very focused on is how our development finance institution, CDC, who are here in the room, but about how they can move into this sector. But also, really importantly, how we can really, as shareholders in many development finance institutions, including the multilateral ones, really try and mobilize and encourage them to work collaboratively and systemically, particularly at country level. So I think around the kind of organized more organised strategies and plans you're talking about. One of the things you didn't have on your list was this sense that the DFIs can sometimes compete with each other. And I think we've seen that when we can really kind of marshal collaborative behaviours, that you can really begin to see some quite exciting investment at scale, and particularly the investment in the right infrastructure to support transformation. And that's something we're really focused on now, which is just not, it's just not kind of power for power's sake or roads for road's sake, but really asking that fundamental question, is this the right infrastructure, particularly the urban infrastructure, to generate this kind of diversified economy? So I think those were the main things I wanted
Brilliant.
to say.
Thank you very
Thanks.
much indeed. So, I mean, she put some interesting points there. It's about a window of opportunity for manufacturing. Have we identified it right? How long is that opportunity still there? A lot about discussion about coordination, including with amongst the DFIs, about training needs, and something about importing. And could you just say just one line about the trade announcement from yesterday, which provides some security for?
Yes, well, I don't know if you saw that we did make an announcement yesterday that we were very clear, and you will have seen in the government's manifesto the commitment to transition the existing EU trade agreements, but we specifically were clear yesterday that we will be continuing the preferential everything but arms agreement for the 48 least developed countries. We think it's a very important announcement for investors, particularly to give investors that sense of stability in the trading environment with the UK. We also were clear that we would also transition the other preferential trading agreements in terms of opportunities to improve the trading regime. Of course, that depends on various developments, but we were also clear that we do think there are ways to offer a very strong package of support for developing countries around their ability to trade into the UK. And we're also working hard to see how we could improve that trade facilitation offer as well.
Very good. We estimate that, here at ODI, I think that the offer is worth about 323 million pounds a year in terms of avoided duties in the UK. And of course, there's more that can be done perhaps for other African countries that are not LDCs. But I think that's a really important announcement and a very good step forward. Very good. So we've heard this about sort of the donor perspective, the public policy perspective. Let's go to a private sector perspective around some of the issues. And we'd like to hear about sort of financing into African entrepreneurs from you.
Good morning. Thanks, Dirk, and the ODI for this invitation today, and also to the fellow panelists. I sit here with two hats. I am a private sector representative. I work at Investec Asset Management full-time, but I'm also an economist at the Wits School of Governance in Johannesburg. So I just want to pick up, before I go into my own presentation, which... Okay, forward, right. Yep. Okay, so before I go into my own presentation, I just want to pick up on 2 points from the panel and also what we discussed this morning. Coordination around issues, which, you know, Jonathan, it's one of the key planks of your paper. And the thing that I'm finding interesting is that, you know, we know automation is happening, the fourth industrial revolution. It's come up as well in Federico's presentation. So why are we not planning aggressively for the jobs that are going to disappear in all of these sectors? I mean, you know, we're talking about entrepreneurship and industrialisation, but there needs to, I think, you know, be an urgent shift towards planning towards all of these jobs that are going to disappear in the global economy. The training and skills that needs to happen needs to be in tech. The financial services need to be in fintech. I mean, mobile payments are key multipliers at the moment. You know, I think some of those numbers are not even captured in GDP. You know, automation. But it will also mean that there's an opportunity to scale jump, because we're starting from such a low base in Africa. There's an opportunity to be nimble. And I'll just stop there. But tech, I cannot stress enough. Why are we not planning for the shift? I mean, I almost feel like we're kind of looking backwards with the existing technical arrangements, knowing that there's this big urgent shift that's required. Similarly, climate change, which I also mentioned this morning. As Dirk said, I was just in Basel on Friday, where we hosted Investec Asset Management. We host some central bankers from the eastern and southern states in Africa. And automation was one of their big concerns. The other concern was climate change. I think of all the regions on the planet, Africa is the most vulnerable to the risks that are coming from climate change, displacement from migration, food, droughts, and so on. But at the same time, there are opportunities. So if you think about the private sector perspective, within climate change, there are also great financial opportunities for people who start that shift now. So I'm talking about investing in renewables, talking about moving to green tech. And again, there's an opportunity for Africa here because, you know, if there's a demand for power, there's a demand, all these infrastructural requirements can happen with a view to plan around the vulnerabilities around climate change. So those are two kind of passionate things that I need to just put on the agenda, and then I'll start with my presentation. So I'll just give a very brief overview of the firm, like 30 seconds. So the kind of key bullet points to note here is that we are 25 years old, founded in 1991 in Africa. And I think this is quite important for my perspective here today and how we think about some of the issues in the private sector and what we can contribute to economic development as a firm. We're now global, and we manage about $115 billion across the world. So this gives just a sort of perspective of how our assets are split. We're split, the majority sitting in emerging markets, 59%, and the rest of our assets are global. Interestingly, our All China Fund is one of our best performing funds at the moment. So there's a lot of interesting stuff going on. The African asset sits here in this orange bit, in the private, what we call our private market strategies. So that's stuff like private equity, real estate funds, and also the credit funds, which I will explain to you now. So there's about 5 billion sitting in alternatives. So what's interesting to me about Investec Asset Management and attracted me to the firm as a manager, and this is an important point in terms of what the private sector can do in terms of all of these constraints and the kind of world that will facilitate. I mean, the thing is, if you don't have a sustainable perspective, there will be no business environment with which to operate from. So I sit in the Investment Institute at Investec, where we do thought leadership, and we try to integrate our firm values, not only within the firm, but also in the broader community with which we engage. So part of that is stewardship, and that is how we look after our clients' money. So that is an active role. We also, at the moment, are engaging quite a lot on the idea of long-termism, which is another issue that I brought up this morning. So the thing is, if you want to do job creation, alleviate poverty, create infrastructure skills, these are really long-term goals. Unfortunately, we're sitting in a financial sector, which is, and also I think a lot of other sectors, which is driven by short-term incentives, quarterly results, quarterly reporting. So how do you reconcile that kind of mentality for instant gratification with the kinds of issues that we've got to resolve here? So we are participating in that conversation through the Business and Sustainable Development Commission, where we have been talking about how we can shift capital to the long term to meet the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. Also, one of my colleagues is seconded to the United Nations Sustainable Development and Financing Network, and we're also part of the Coalition for Inclusive Capitalism. So in terms of how we have operated in Africa, this timeline here just shows some of the key milestones and some of the funds that I'm going to talk about here today. So credit opportunities in 2008, that's kind of the expertise we started gaining in this lending to the private sector. And then you'll see that we've got the Emerging Africa Infrastructure Fund, which Rachel will be very familiar with because DFID is one of the key donors there. And we also this year launching the Africa Real Estate Fund, which looks at prime office space and raises those funds around those opportunities. Now, I don't know if people actually realize that this, I joined Investec in February, and this part of the work that we do in infrastructural development was for me extremely fascinating, that I saw that, the DFI work taking place within the private sector. And I think some of the efficiency gains from those exchanges are, I can imagine, invaluable. Myself having, studied finance, I've always wondered, am I going to go the DFI route? I'm going to go the private sector route. And it's really great to see people coordinating around their problem solving. And I think this is really, because I think the problem is from the private sector perspective, people, say if you're Ontario pension fund sitting in Canada, you maybe have a sustainable or ESG imperative on your fund. You maybe want to contribute to something sustainable. You want to diversify your portfolio because you want to go into an emerging markets, but you know absolutely nothing about Africa. And somebody made the point this morning that there's also needs to be sort of like a reverse education about what opportunities are available. And I think the most interesting thing is the due diligence that is required in Africa. And I think we're kind of one of the pioneers in this space. So I've done a lot of risk management around our investments. And I think capital market development is the point I want to get to now. Because, the thing is, if I think about, let me think, is it Sierra Leone, which I think has one company on its stock exchange, and you've got markets like the UK with like immense amounts of liquidity and information and so on. So the thing is, what's also difficult for investors is they may want to go into that market, but again, there's no skills. There are no investment bankers. There are no, sort of massive underwriters that can put together $1 billion deal and sell it to investment banks on roadshows. So that's capital market development. So when we do some of these projects in Africa, of course, there's the nice fuzzy warm feeling from the developmental impact, and that's very important to us as a firm and where we come from and our ethos. But it's also, it's also in the long run, once those capital markets start becoming more sophisticated, that means second rounds of financing can come in, and we'll be pioneers and we'll be ahead of other people there as well. So I think that's just a very important point that I want to make there. That countries need a lot of support in terms of how to raise these funds on the capital market. And then just in terms of the entrepreneurship and industrialisation angle, I think financing for infrastructure is key. And it's very difficult for that to happen without public and private coordination. Some of the constraints in Africa create massive opportunities. All of these companies, whether they be tech, whether they be textiles, they're going to need electricity, they're going to need water, they're going to need roads to bring the workers to the factories, they're going to need, educated workforces and so on. So there, a lot of opportunities just to create vital infrastructure. The infrastructure funding gap at the moment in Africa sits at 31 billion. The total annual required investment is 93 billion. So, the thing is, if you think we've only got about 4.5 billion, there's still quite a lot of capacity to get involved in projects there. So then I just want to go a bit more granular and try and finish up because I don't want to go over time. So, as I said, we have this credit opportunities strategy, which we started in 2008, and that expertise allowed us to win this mandate with the Emerging Africa Infrastructure Fund, which is about the majority of our infrastructure assets under management, 700 million with an annual flow of $200 million US. And what's interesting about the EAIF, it is a public-private partnership, but there's also development actors and development agencies involved in there, the Swiss, the British, KfW and FMO. And that just gives an explanation of how EAIF sits within the PIDGE. So you may be familiar with some of these other organizations like Infraco and so on. And we're managing the entire mandate for EAIF. So this is really, really exciting stuff. To get up in the morning and think that my colleagues are doing these things, it's just not what you expect to be happening in the private sector. And then, just very quickly, these are the types of finance that we can provide, lending to the private sector for examples of things we've done is like Helios Towers, IHS Towers for mobile, Kivu in Uganda. We've done a lot of power plants and so on. And that's sort of just the mix. And where we have gone into manufacturing, it's been steel, which is obviously required for infrastructure. So there's a lot of thinking around how these efforts support one another. That just gives an overview of some of the growth, the projects by company, the splits by sectors. And I'll just leave the summary of the transactions because that's quite a busy slide and we've run out of time. So in sum, many of these transactions will deepen capital markets and improve the capacity of countries to raise capital, allowing for the liquidity and market structure for second rounds of flows and further developmental multipliers.
Okay, thank you very much. And just one question on sort of how close you come to the manufacturers. So, I mean, we discuss entrepreneurs, of course, more widely, but manufacturing in particular. And sort of a lot of funds that you discuss are about infrastructure. I mean, in various forms, whether it's energy or mobile phone technology. How close do you come to a garments factory or electronics factory or a special economic zone that can foster clusters of manufacturers?
Okay, so I'm not a portfolio manager, but I was sitting with one of my colleagues, did a presentation at Basel on this fund, Martin, and he's been with the EIF for 9 years. And I mean, he goes, into the rural areas, coordinates with the finance ministry. So I think, it's sitting, quite, it's not a kind of abstract process for them. I think they're very actively involved. They're traveling a lot on the ground.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Okay, but they actually invest also in manufacturers. Do you invest private equity? Or?
Well, there's a steel plant in Tunisia that I know that we've invested in, and that really busy slide has all the actual, like Seacom, Ethiopian Airlines is one that I mentioned to the ambassador this morning. Mm-hmm. So into actual companies. Yeah.
Okay, good. Well, that's been fascinating, these presentations, and it's now time for the audience to come in. I think there are at least two important topics that we've got to discuss. One is about the importance of coordination, and I think we heard it about coordinating buyers, investors, African governments. That's important. Maybe also coordinating DFIs. So that would be probably important to discuss. What are the ideas we have here? What can be done on this? And the other issue that I think Rachel in particular put on the table, but also Desne at the end, is about the window of opportunity for manufacturing. And maybe also I'd like to hear from the ambassador from Ethiopia on this, is that there's phenomenal growth in employment in manufacturing in Ethiopia, of course from a low base. It's got still some way to go. There's still sort of a window of opportunity there. How long is this window of opportunity? And how do we prepare for the future, 20 years, 15 years ahead? That sort of the other jobs that need to be created around automation and the like. So I suppose that is an important also challenge that was put to Federica in particular.